Good evening. This is the Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, January 26th, 2023. I'm Elliot Greenspan, standing in for Dennis Speed, who is spending at least the first half of this evening on an important organizing initiative. Knowing Dennis, he will probably make it at some point during this discussion, and he can report on that initiative himself. But let me welcome everyone at a rather, shall we say, historic conjuncture, a totally extraordinary moment, a moment fraught with incredible tension, which I trust you all feel. What I want to do is concentrate for a few minutes on the unraveling, on the process of escalation in this world economic strategic crisis, which took a catastrophic step forward yesterday with the combined announcements by Biden and Scholz of Germany of the commitment to the most advanced tanks, which the U.S. and the Germans have, commitments of such tanks to Ukraine, as they keep piling in the weapon systems with now fighter jets under discussion and so on. This is a catastrophic escalation. I want to just develop how this is functioning and then indicate the growing activation of important voices in the U.S., in Europe, and beyond over the last 24, 36 hours in response to this, and situate all of this in terms of the building international campaign spearheaded by Elliot LaRouche and the Schiller Institute for many months now, which is organizing day by day growing international support for the initiative proffered by Pope Francis to offer the Vatican as a venue for negotiation with no preconditions between Russia and Ukraine. And toward that end, Gerald Belsky, LaRouche leader, author, has just completed a very important report which will appear in Executive Intelligence Review, the weekly EIR, next week. But Jerry's focus being the historic role of the Vatican, of Pope Benedict XV in 1914 in World War I, of Monsignor Montini in World War II, Montini who became Pope Paul VI, of Pope John XXIII in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then subsequent with Kennedy and Khrushchev, which to me indicates the extraordinary role of the Vatican historically, and therefore the actual potential which Helga LaRouche has focused in on for some months now, that's been opened up by that offer. Let me situate this appropriately, that you have the developments of yesterday. You have, preceding that, the Speaker of the Russian State Duma, the Russian Parliament, Vyacheslav Volodin, who said, deliveries of offensive weapons to the Kiev regime will lead to a global catastrophe. If Washington and NATO countries supply weapons that will be used to strike civilian cities and attempt to seize our territories as they threaten, this will lead to retaliatory measures using more powerful weapons. End quote. Both Scholz and Biden have said for most of a year that this commitment of such advanced weapon systems, typified by these tanks, the most advanced tanks in NATO, this will lead to World War III. This represents World War III. That's what they said. And now look at what they're doing. You have the statement of Chrystia Freeland, who is presently, I think, the finance minister or deputy prime minister of Canada, who is a great admirer of Stepan Bandera, the Hitler of Ukraine during World War II, And Friedland's boasting, look, war production will be great. This will be the biggest boost to the economy, which gives away a crucial element of what is in fact going on. You have the foreign minister of Germany, this Green, Baerbock, who said a couple of days ago, quote, "We are fighting war against Russia." Think about that in historic context, going back to the Second War, to the 27 million Russians, or people of the citizens of the Soviet Union who perished in a war against fascism, primarily against the Nazis. And now you have this German cabinet minister saying we're fighting war against Russia. Or Bojo, the former Prime Minister of Britain, Boris Johnson, who again was just in Kiev a few days ago, is in the British press again, pushing this line to Zelensky and company, don't worry about Russian red lines. We've passed some of them, and Putin hasn't used his nuclear weapons yet. So don't worry about that. This is what the British advocated last spring. They called it a Crimean Missile Crisis, a Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids. This is where we are at this moment. In the face of this, you've got a growing chorus of voices speaking out as the LaRouche movement, the Schiller Institute, led by Helga LaRouche, we've been organizing, mobilizing for many months to catalyze such a movement of world citizens to stop nuclear world war. With the leading edge of this being an immediate negotiation with no preconditions, as put forward by Pope Francis, to catalyze a Westphalian process of dialogue, a dialogue of adversaries who can define common interests, as Helga has in her 10 principles for new security and development architecture, which, if you've been listening over these last Thursday nights, Jerry Rose took this up. Dennis has been emphasizing this. Hopefully you've reviewed those principles. We can come back to that. But this amidst the dramatic progress of much of the global South, organizing a new economic order centered on the Belt and Road Initiative of the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative of Xi Jinping, which is an essential basis for such negotiation of peace through development, but it also threatens the modern Zeus, that is the London, Wall Street, international financial oligarchy. Okay. In that context, with the announcements of yesterday, in terms of where that is manifestly going, the catastrophic escalation that you have in the last 36 hours or so, President Trump put out, as you may have heard late today, a tweet on Truth Social, a post on Truth Social, quote, "First come the tanks, then come the nukes. Get this crazy war ended now. So easy to do," Trump wrote. Then you have the dramatic intervention by the VIPs, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, of which Ray McGovern is a co-founder. They entitled this one, this is an alert memorandum for the president, entitled Leopards versus the Russian Bear, Decisions in an Intelligence Vacuum. And they warn Biden, as they've warned presidents since the lies around Bush in 2003 and Iraq, and they say to Biden, it's been clear that you've not been adequately briefed on two issues of major importance. The war, number one, the war in Ukraine, and number two, the strategic partnership between Russia and China. We want to prepare you for a major shock, Russia's winter offensive is about to roll over the Ukrainian army. At that point, unwelcome choices will have to be made. Off-ramps must be sought. Again, the sooner the better. And they make clear given, as they put it in their conclusion, there's a large conceptual and exceptionally dangerous disconnect in which the war party controlling the Biden administration, the Congress, and so on, the Mickey Mouse apparatus in America, a disconnect which they continue to put forward. Simply stated, it is not possible to win the war against Russia, as they say must happen, and avoid World War III. It is downright scary that Austin may think it's possible. In any case, the Kremlin has to assume he thinks so. It is a very dangerous solution. You'll see in the Executive Alert Service of EIR, which I hope and trust you receive every morning, you'll see this VIPS memo either in full or the full concept involved. Study it, review it. These are leading retired former military strategic intelligence professionals who know their business. Then yesterday, Silvio Berlusconi, the former prime minister of Italy, whose party Forza Italia is part of the governing coalition, he was told the media there that he's upset that no one except the Pope and the Holy See has solutions leading to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. So he reiterated that initiative from the Pope, and there was RT quoted him indicating an important response coming from the Kremlin on this. Then Congressman Paul Gosar, the Republican from Arizona, in response to the Biden tank initiative, said, quote, Biden's decision brings us one step closer to dragging America directly into a massive global war. This is a dangerous and reckless escalation, matched by an historic escalation by Germany, which has now violated its post-World War II policy of non-intervention. And he quotes Biden months ago saying, you send this kind of equipment with American pilots and crews, you can say that's called World War III. And he stresses America should send no more tanks or any war material or help prolong a needless war. We need peace between Ukraine and Russia. The war needs to be resolved. America should be a peacemaker, not a warmonger. And then you have an important article by the leaders of Code Pink, Medea Benjamin Company, leaders of the peace movement in the United States, entitled, What Can the U.S. Bring to the Peace Table for Ukraine? With a series of interesting proposals toward that end. Again, hopefully you are subscribed to the ER Alert, and you'll see the full report in the morning. So I will conclude by emphasizing, as Helga LaRouche does in her webcast of yesterday on the Schiller Institute site, that what is crucial in our historic mission here is to continue to build the process of opposition to the endless war, which will lead to nuclear war if it continues. But we've now got over 200 VIPs from at least 37 countries who signed the Schiller Institute letter of support for the Pope's offer for the purpose of indicating growing recognition of the danger and of the moment of opportunity, perhaps the last moment of opportunity. In a matter of 3 days or so, we have over 500 citizens beyond the VIPs from 57 nations calling for a mobilization to initiate such negotiations. There are more voices in Germany, in Mexico, in many of the NATO countries and so on, who are calling for negotiations, not escalation into world war. And as Helga put it, the more countries, the more institutions, and the more people who support the Pope and give him backing in this idea, the better. And she's referring to this process with such letters going into a major Schiller Institute conference on Saturday, February 4. More on that later. So with that said, let me introduce Gerald Belsky, LaRouche leader, author, leading organizer of this process, but to focus in on this next major report and article forthcoming in EIR. Jerry?
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
I think so.
Okay, good. Hope everyone else can. So this report that I wrote that is coming into the EIR next week is designed to elaborate why Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called for this mobilization to support the Pope's offer of immediate peace negotiations. Historically, it's not so well known that the Vatican, among some people perhaps, but in general it's not that well known, that the Vatican has played a critical role, in a sense almost irregardless of the specific Pope. In some cases, the Pope himself would play a critical role. But I'm citing three examples, which is in World War I, the Pope at the time, Pope Benedict XV, who had been born Giacomo della Chiesa, he had long been a Vatican diplomat, and he had been Undersecretary of State for the Vatican. He called for an end to this war immediately. He became Pope, in fact, a few weeks after the war broke out in 1914. And he said that this war was the result of class conflict, of nationalism, of racism, of obsession with material goods and contempt for authority. But he called for a Christmas truce, which people may have heard about, this famous Christmas truce that actually partially broke out in the Christmas of 1914, when a few soldiers on the Western Front actually, it almost miraculously, it seemed, actually had a truce amongst each other for a day or two. But the Pope called further for peace negotiations to take place. He was ignored by the belligerent countries. Unfortunately, most of the Catholics in all the different nations supported the war, so he was being he did not have a favorable audience for these calls. He put together a peace process in 1915, and he put out a specific peace proposal in 1917. But the result was that he was, by secret agreement among the Allies, written out of all peace negotiations as they occurred at Versailles. And the Pope denounced the Versailles Agreement as based on vengeance and not a true peace. Let me just read you something from an article written about him. He said, all sides should forego claims of compensation, which would have proved so disastrous a part of the Versailles Treaty later. This was while the war was going on, before it was over. But he said most of the damage, or rather the article points out that the Allies said since most of the damage was supposedly caused by Germany, they refused to listen to what the Pope said, and they refused to listen to his advice at the peace agreement, and he was not invited and had no role in the Versailles Agreement, which he said was a vengeful peace, and that it was not going to end the war. And in fact, it really only set the stage for the next war, World War II. He said neither the peace treaty nor the League of Nations were based on Christian principles. And ironically, the one country that actually praised the Pope and actually built a statue to the Pope after World War I was Turkey, which was a secular but majority Muslim nation, which erected in Istanbul a statue to Benedict XV with the inscription, the great Pope of the world tragedy, the benefactor of all people, irrespective of all nationality and religion. Now, the second example of the Vatican as a key venue for neutral negotiations is the story in World War II that we know personally because Lyndon LaRouche was told this by a friend of his who had been a leading figure in the OSS. And that is the story of how the United States OSS representative at the Vatican attempted to end the war with Japan before the atomic bombs were dropped. His name is Martin Quigley, and he wrote a book in 1991 on the Peace Without Hiroshima, Secret Action at the Vatican. And he actually reports that he had been instructed by the head of the OSS, who had been an ally of, close confidant and friend of Franklin Roosevelt, General William P. Donovan, who had instructed Quigley, who was sent as a secret agent into the Vatican under the cover of being a representative of the American film industry, but he was providing intelligence from the Vatican of what was going on internationally among all the nations for the United States to evaluate. But one of his missions was to look out, he was told, for any option to conclude peace with Japan. Now, when the war was over in Germany, in Europe, in April 1945, or May, actually, 1945, unfortunately, Franklin Roosevelt had died. And that sabotaged the effort to achieve peace. Because what Quigley did is he actually approached, through Vatican intermediaries that he was in touch with, the Japanese representative, who ironically had been sent to the Vatican by the emperor in 1941, specifically with the same mission. He was told by the emperor, you are to look out for any option to negotiate peace. At that point in 1945, everybody knew the Japanese had been defeated. They could not win. The Japanese government was divided, but the majority of it, the Navy and the emperor, were actually negotiating for peace. They had included the Vatican as a possibility, but it wasn't their major option, which Quigley thinks was a mistake. They were trying to negotiate through Russia to conclude a peace with the Allies, which Russia had been part, but Russia was not then at war with Japan. What Quigley did was he sized up the situation, and he approached through a friend of his at the Vatican, who was part of the Vatican Secretary of State, the Japanese ambassador, and made an offer that if they would open up a channel of communication, he could get a high-level official to Rome in a day or two to have secret discussions. The question on the table, which everybody knew, contrary to all of the propaganda about how Japan would never surrender, was simply the question of the role of the emperor. And the term unconditional surrender was the problem. So therefore, the issue was what was the real condition? Would the emperor be kept in power? And after Quigley made an initial contact with the Japanese ambassador through intermediaries, the question came to him, what are the terms of surrender? And Quigley, although he was not authorized to make specific terms, he said, on the question of unconditional surrender, these can be interpreted different ways, and I'm quite certain that if the Japanese people want the emperor to be retained, the United States will respect that position. That all of this information was sent via radio message to the Foreign Ministry of Japan. And the way we know that these negotiations actually got through to Japan is that the United States was breaking the Japanese code. And in the archives, years later, Martin Quigley found the coded messages that were delivered as the top briefing item for the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the Joint Chief, the head of the Chiefs, the Chairman of the U.S. Military Chief Marshal, and most importantly, Stimson, who was the Secretary of War. And nothing was done about this discussion. The Japanese were clearly aware, were open, they were ready to have communication. The army in Japan was the holdout against the war ending. But if this question of unconditional surrender could have been negotiated, there's no question Japan would have surrendered on those terms. And in fact, those were the exact terms that we accepted. What Quigley discovered through his research later is that there had been a discussion at the White House over this very issue after Roosevelt had died. And Truman was told by the Undersecretary of State, Joseph Grew, who was the Japanese specialist, had been ambassador before the war, that you have to make a speech saying that you will retain the emperor. That will allow them to surrender without losing face, because otherwise they will fight to the last man. And Truman said, I agree with you, but talk to my military advisors. And at the next day's meeting, Grew said in a memorandum that he was told by Stimson and others, and it was really Stimson who made this decision on behalf of Wall Street and London. We agree with you. We should say that. That is going to be the term, but we don't want to say it right now for a matter of timing. There's a military question of timing. And Grew was never told what the timing was, but it's certainly implied in Quigley's book that the timing was Truman was waiting to drop the bomb, or he was advised to do that by the Wall Street London faction that had taken over after Truman. After Roosevelt's death. So despite the fact that the Vatican could have been the site of successful negotiations, Quigley's messages and the Japanese message to the foreign ministry were never answered. And what Quigley figures is, had the Japanese heard back from the United States government, they would have responded. Now, the final thing I want to go into, which is the most important and very relevant for today, is actually a successful negotiation at the Vatican, which is actually not that well known. But this is the negotiations that were established between Kennedy, Khrushchev, and the Pope at the time, John XXIII, which played a critical role in not only resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in opening the door to ending the Cold War, which almost occurred had Kennedy not been killed. What happened, which is detailed in the book that some people may have seen, by James W. Douglas, the Catholic worker, anti-war activist, who wrote a book called The Unspeakable, Why Kennedy's Death, JFK's Death Matters. And it's also detailed in another book by Norman Cousins, who was the head of the peace movement at the time during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what is exposed in these two books is that at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a meeting of peace activists on both, well, I wouldn't say peace activists and realistic, I would say, statesmen from both the Soviet Union and the United States, who had regular peace conferences on disarmament. And they were going on the third annual conference at the time of the Kennedy speech, where he imposed the blockade on Cuba after it was discovered that the Russians had put missiles on Cuba. And at that point, the question was, would this annual peace meeting break up or not? And they decided, no, by mutual accord, we'll continue with the meeting. At that point, a representative of Pope John appears at the meeting, named Father Felix Morleon, who had established a kind of ecumenical college for social studies and religions. It wasn't just Catholic, but it was promoted by a faction in the Vatican as an ecumenical college. And Montini, who later became Paul VI, was one of the sponsors of this effort. I should just mention, in terms of my previous report on World War II, is that one of the ways that we found out about these negotiations was not only through Quigley's book, but the head of the OSS in Italy, Max Corvo, who later became a friend of Lyndon LaRouche, told him that he had known about these negotiations, and he had discussed them with then Monsignor Montini, who later became Paul VI, who later who succeeded John XXIII. So at this meeting in October 1963, as Kennedy was announcing the blockade, Father Morleon, who had been part of these peace discussions in the past, he came somewhat late to the meetings, but he actually got in touch with the Pope. And the Pope offered to mediate between Kennedy. He said, would it help if I made a statement at this point? And both Kennedy and Khrushchev were open to the Pope issuing a statement, which he did the next day. What he wanted to say was that we should stop the shipping of military goods to Cuba and we should end the blockade, which Khrushchev agreed to. Kennedy said, the problem I have with that specific statement is that it's not enough to stop the shipments. We have to get the missiles that are there out. So the Pope left that part out. But what he did say, which had a very big impact, is he put out a statement that was sent to the United States Embassy and the Soviet Embassy the next day, let me just get you this statement, which was a statement to both political leaders. And this is a quote from Norman Cousins, who wrote about this in a book called The Improbable Triumvirate. But he said, in line with President Kennedy's reservations about how to put this, he said, the Pope made no specific reference to military shipments of the blockade. Instead, he directed himself to the clear obligation of political leaders to avoid taking those steps that could lead to a Holocaust, which is good advice for today. He said that not just Americans and Russians, but all the world's peoples were involved, that their fates could not be disregarded. He said that history would praise any statesman who put the cause of mankind above national considerations. Now, this call by the Pope, which said further that Cold War leaders should, quote, not remain deaf to the cry of humanity for peace. That was the banner headline in Pravda the next day. And after Khrushchev announced that he would pull the missiles out of Cuba, the leading newspaper, Pravda, reprinted the Pope's message, praising, quote, the realism of the Pope concerning the question of peace as a commentary on the necessary measures. And in fact, Khrushchev, it's been pointed out, used the Pope's message against hardliners in his own government to portray himself as a statesman and not a coward who had simply backed down under threat of war. And he later told Norman Cousins, who became an intermediary, that he actually saw the Pope's message as a gleam of hope. What occurred out of this crisis was that Father Morleon, on behalf of the Vatican, offered to the Russians, to the delegates of this peace conference, would you like to have a mediation between the Vatican and Russia, which would be Norman Cousins? We'll send him as an unofficial, unattached, back channel, as it's called. He's not an official representative, but these will be secret negotiations. And the Soviets agreed. Now, I'm quite certain that in that discussion, they had intended to make it a three-way back channel because they knew that Norman Cousins, who was the head of the peace movement at the time, was called SANE, the Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy, was friends with John F. Kennedy. So Kennedy, as was expected, wanted to speak to Cousins before he went and saw Khrushchev and the Pope. And he had a discussion with Cousins, and he told him, the Russians may be surprised. They may think they can't trust the United States. But I want you to let Khrushchev know that there's no person who is running for president for a second term who has more commitment to peace than I am. And he may not realize that I want to work out an agreement with the Russians to end this threat of war. So coming out of the horror of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy realized he had to do something, and Khrushchev realized it. And so in his meeting with Cousins, who was meeting on behalf of the Pope, Khrushchev told Cousins something that world leaders today should be saying. He was asked directly by Cousins, how did it feel to have your fingers so close to the nuclear trigger? And he honestly told Cousins, if being frightened meant that I helped avert such insanity, then I am glad I was frightened. One of the problems of the world today is that not enough people are sufficiently frightened by the danger of nuclear war. So Khrushchev actually, was being quite honest with him. The question that came up is, how can I trust the United States? Because there were many incidents. We don't have to go through them all. But as today, there were incidents on both sides where neither side could trust each other. And the issue at the time was that Kennedy wanted to conclude a nuclear test ban treaty coming off of the Cuban Missile Crisis to at least take an initial first step toward peace, something concrete. And Khrushchev wanted to demonstrate to his people that he could get a concrete agreement from the United States after agreeing to take the missiles out of Cuba. So they were both very eager to get something. The problem was that in the past, Khrushchev had thought he worked out an agreement. There would be inspections of only basically 3 inspections under this new proposed missile treaty inspection on nuclear testing. And in the United States, Kennedy thought there was no way he could get a treaty through the Senate without 8 inspections a year. And the Russian military leaders thought this was going to be just the basis for spying. And Khrushchev said, if you go for more than 3, forget it. I've already sold them on 3. Now you're going for 8. Forget it. So the question then for Kennedy, he said, the ball's in your court. I believe you. I believe you want peace. I do trust you personally, but I can't sell this to my people. And Kennedy, when he heard this from Cousins, said, ironically, we both have the same problem. We both have hardliners who don't trust either country. So what should we do? Now, Cousins, who had been talking to the Pope about this question of peace and setting up communications, the Pope was actually very happy that the Russians had covered his speech, had given him a lot of coverage. He said, we have to maintain the lines of communication and strengthen them. And when Kennedy asked Cousins directly, he said, what do you think I should do? Do you have any suggestions how we can break this logjam? Cousins, on the basis of his discussions with the Pope and his experience with talking to the Russians, said, I think, Mr. President, you have to make the most important speech of your life, of your career in the presidency, and you have to take a bold new initiative to establish trust with the Russian people. And what Kennedy did, based on suggestions by Norman Cousins, inspired by the Pope, who at the time, which I didn't mention, he knew he was dying of cancer. He had a limited time left, a few months left to live. And he was working on an encyclical called Peace on Earth, Pacem in Terris. It was very important, and this actually helped influence the speech which Kennedy gave in June of 1963 at American University. The Pope died 1 week before the speech was given. But it was known what was going to be in this Pacem in Terris, and in fact, it was released in April before the speech. But 1 week before the encyclical was released, Norman Cousins gave Khrushchev an advance copy that was translated into Russian. And what the Pope said in this speech, I just want to end here, because and just go through a little bit of Kennedy's American University speech. But what the Pope said in the encyclical, which did influence the speech that Kennedy ultimately did give, which called for ending the Cold War. This Pacem in Terris is very similar in principle to Helga LaRouche's 10 Principles. And the reason why I say that is it was not just calling for peace in the abstract as just a nice idea. It was saying that peace is based on the order of the universe. In fact, the statement, the summary statement on the title page of the encyclical is that peace between all peoples must be based on truth, justice, love, and freedom. And the first section of the encyclical was entitled Order in the Universe, which stated very boldly, quote, that a marvelous order predominates in the world of living beings and in the forces of nature, is the plain lesson which the progress of modern research and the discoveries of technology teach us. And it is part of the greatness of man that he can appreciate that order and devise the means for harnessing those forces for his own benefit. Now, Helga, in her 10 Principles, as people know by looking at them, emphasizes the point that Lynn made, which is more explicit than just harnessing these, which is good, and using them for man's purpose to order the universe, but that man can create new principles in the image of God. So it's more explicit on this question of creativity in the image of God. But in both cases, both the Pacem in Terris and 10 Principles of Helga, the idea of peace between nations is based on a natural ordering of the universe in which man essentially is capable of acting on the laws of the universe to achieve peace. And in both cases, the common good or the general welfare is promoted, as an ordering principle, and the fact that there must be such a common good not only within nations, by nations, for the dignity of man, but between nations. The thing that the Pope emphasized is you cannot attack a nation even if you disagree with its ideology. Now, we don't have the problem with communism with Russia. We did then. And what the Pope said then is even if you have a philosophy you don't agree with, the fact is that people who are acting on a philosophy you may disagree with, like communism, still can represent very good qualities and do good that is consistent with right reason. And therefore, we can find a way to cooperate with them. Now, Kennedy, actually, I want to end with this. He took that idea in his famous speech in June of 1963, where he called for ending the Cold War. And I'm just going to quote from James W. Douglas from his book, The Unspeakable. The U.S. president in his greatest speech echoed the call of Parliamentarians for cooperation with an ideological opponent. In the American University address, he made the same distinction the Pope did. Quote, no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity, but we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. He then took the Pope's theme and ran with it. He first cited Russians and Americans' mutual disgust with war, reminding his American audience of what war had done to the Soviet Union and what it could do to the entire planet. Quote, this is Kennedy, today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries would become the primary targets. It's an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest partners are the two most in danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, all would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And then Douglas goes on. Following Pope John's support of meetings with ideological opponents for the attainment of some practical end, Kennedy praised agreements with the Soviet Union as essential to ending the arms race before it was too late. Then came the heart of the speech, the most eloquent statement of John F. Kennedy's presidency. Quote, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is we all inhabit the small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. And then he finally ended, we should re-examine our attitude toward the Cold War, remembering that we are not engaged in a debate. This is good advice for today. Seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment. And I want to just point out one other thing in this speech, which is extremely relevant for this policy of forcing Russia into a nuclear showdown, which is the British policy today. Kennedy said, with nuclear powers, we cannot force them to choose between humiliating retreat or nuclear war. This is a reflection of the bankruptcy of our policy, and it is a virtual collective death wish for humanity. And that is what Kennedy, John XXIII, and Khrushchev were fighting against, and that's what we must fight against today. That's what we must fight against today. Thank you.